You find yourself standing in the royal palace of Madrid, 1814. The chandeliers cast dancing shadows across marble floors, still stained with the blood of liberal politicians. The man sitting on the throne before you has just returned from 6 years of French captivity, and Spain's nobles are celebrating their beloved king's restoration. What they don't yet realize is that they've just welcomed back the most sadistic monarch in Spanish history, a man who will spend the next 20 years systematically torturing his own people with a creativity that would make medieval inquisitors seem merciful. Ferdinand VII didn't just execute his enemies. He collected their severed heads as trophies, personally designed torture devices for political prisoners, and turned public executions into theatrical spectacles, where he would applaud particularly creative methods of inflicting pain. While fairy tales teach us about evil stepmothers and wicked witches, they never prepared us for a real king who was so monstrously cruel that his own wife attempted suicide rather than share his bed, and whose reign of terror was so systematic that it created the template for modern totalitarian states. The Spanish people thought they were getting their patriot king back from Napoleon's clutches. What they actually got was something far worse than French occupation. They got a Spanish king who had learned that absolute power, combined with absolute cruelty, could create a level of control that foreign invaders could only dream of achieving. Ferdinand had spent 6 years in captivity studying how power really works, and he came back ready to implement lessons that would turn Spain into a laboratory for state-sponsored psychological warfare. Tell me in the comments, where in the world are you hearing about Ferdinand the Monster King I love? Knowing our global community of truth seekers, all of us drawn to those moments when the official story of beloved monarchs crumbles under the weight of documented evidence. Because what Ferdinand did to Spain reveals something profound about how quickly hope can transform into horror when we stop paying attention to the psychological fitness of those who rule us. March 1814 was supposed to be Spain's moment of triumph. After 6 brutal years of Napoleonic occupation, the Spanish people had finally driven out the French forces through guerrilla warfare that gave the world the term guerrilla itself. Cities across Spain exploded in celebration as news spread that their legitimate king, Ferdinand VII, was returning from his captivity in France. Crowds gathered in Madrid streets, throwing flowers and shouting, "Long live the king! We see as church bells rang across the countryside. The narrative was perfect for a Hollywood movie. The Patriot King returns to liberate his people from foreign tyranny. Ferdinand had been portrayed throughout the occupation as the desired one, el deseado, the rightful ruler whose return would restore Spain's glory and independence. Liberal intellectuals had even written a progressive constitution in 1812, creating Spain's first experiment with constitutional monarchy and democratic representation. Everything was set up for a beautiful restoration story. Ferdinand's first proclamation seemed to confirm the fairy tale. He spoke eloquently about restoring traditional Spanish values and healing the wounds of occupation. He met with liberal leaders who presented him with the new constitution, and while he didn't immediately embrace it, he spoke diplomatically about studying the will of the Spanish people and ensuring all voices were heard in the restoration process. Court observers noted his apparent maturity. 6 years of captivity had seemingly transformed the petulant prince into a thoughtful monarch. The Spanish people had every reason for optimism. They had successfully resisted the most powerful military force in Europe, created progressive governmental institutions, and now their legitimate king was back to lead them into a new era of prosperity and freedom. What could possibly go wrong with this perfect liberation narrative? But here's what the celebrating crowds didn't know. Ferdinand had spent those 6 years in French captivity, very carefully studying how Napoleon controlled populations through systematic terror. He had observed how fear could be weaponized, how psychological warfare could break resistance more effectively than military force, and how the appearance of legitimacy could provide cover for unprecedented brutality. Ferdinand wasn't returning as a grateful monarch, he was returning as a student of tyranny, who was eager to implement what he had learned. The first hint that something was seriously wrong came within weeks of Ferdinand's return. Instead of embracing the constitution that had been written in his name, he began making subtle comments about foreign influences and the need to purify Spanish institutions. He started meeting privately with ultra-conservative advisors who whispered about the dangers of revolutionary contamination and the necessity of strong measures to ensure stability. But these early warning signs were easy to dismiss. After 6 years of warfare and occupation, most Spanish people were exhausted and willing to give their returned king the benefit of the doubt. When Ferdinand began talking about administrative reorganization and national security measures, it sounded like reasonable post-war planning. Who could argue with wanting to strengthen Spain after such a traumatic period? The liberal intellectuals who had written the Constitution tried to maintain their optimism, even as Ferdinand's language grew increasingly ominous. They told themselves that he just needed time to adjust to the new political realities, that he would eventually see the wisdom of constitutional government. After all, he was dealing with the aftermath of a brutal occupation. Surely some temporary security measures were understandable while the country stabilized. What nobody understood yet was that Ferdinand hadn't been broken by his captivity. He had been educated by it. He had learned that traditional monarchy was actually too weak, too dependent on voluntary compliance and social cooperation. He had discovered that true power required making people afraid to even think about resistance, and he was about to show Spain exactly what he had learned about the science of systematic terror. The Spanish people thought they were celebrating liberation. What they were actually celebrating was the beginning of the most sophisticated experiment in state-sponsored psychological warfare that Europe had ever seen. Ferdinand had come home with a plan that would make the Inquisition look like amateur hour. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. First, let's examine how Ferdinand's administrative reorganization began to reveal its true purpose and why the Spanish people didn't realize they were watching their democracy disappear, one reasonable security measure at a time. Ferdinand's systematic dismantling of Spanish democracy began with language that sounded perfectly reasonable to a war-weary population. In May 1814, he issued what he called temporary administrative adjustments to deal with the unfortunate confusion that had developed during the French occupation. He explained that while the Spanish people's intentions had been patriotic, the revolutionary period had created institutional irregularities that needed to be corrected before normal government could resume. The 1812 Constitution was suspended temporarily, while Ferdinand's advisors conducted a comprehensive review of its provisions. Liberal newspapers found themselves subject to new editorial guidelines to prevent the spread of destabilizing misinformation during the delicate transition period. Political clubs were required to register with new public safety committees that would ensure their activities remained constructive and patriotic. None of this seemed particularly alarming at first. Spain had just emerged from 6 years of chaos, foreign occupation, and guerrilla warfare. Most people understood that some administrative cleanup would be necessary. The language Ferdinand used was diplomatic, bureaucratic, and focused on stability rather than ideology. He wasn't attacking liberalism directly, he was simply rationalizing Spanish institutions to ensure effective governance. The liberal politicians who had written the Constitution tried to work within Ferdinand's new framework. They submitted their political organizations for registration, agreed to the editorial guidelines for their publications, and participated in consultative meetings where they could present their views to royal advisors. They still believed that reason and patience would eventually convince Ferdinand to embrace constitutional monarchy. But then the parameters of Ferdinand's administrative reorganization began to expand in subtle but disturbing ways. The public safety committees started requiring detailed membership lists from political organizations, including personal information about members' families, financial situations, and social connections. The editorial guidelines for newspapers became increasingly specific, eventually requiring pre-approval for any articles discussing political topics. And the consultative meetings transformed into lengthy interrogations where liberal politicians were questioned about their true loyalties and foreign connections. Dr. Matteo Seoane, one of the liberal physicians involved in drafting health provisions for the new constitution, kept detailed notes about these escalating security measures. His diary, discovered in monastery archives decades later, describes the growing unease among Spanish intellectuals as Ferdinand's temporary measures became increasingly invasive and permanent. We are told these procedures are necessary for national healing, Swain wrote, but each week brings new requirements that feel more like preparation for war against the Spanish people themselves. The age demographic of people being subjected to these security reviews was also shifting in an ominous direction. Initially, Ferdinand's advisors focused on senior liberal politicians who had held prominent positions during the constitutional period. But gradually, the investigations expanded to include younger intellectuals, university students, and even teenage children of liberal families who had expressed interest in democratic ideas. Maria Francisca de Sales Portocarrero, a liberal nobleman's daughter, wrote letters to her cousin describing her family's experience with Ferdinand's youth guidance programs. At age 16, she was required to attend weekly sessions where royal advisors questioned her about her political education and tested her loyalty to traditional Spanish values. The sessions, she wrote, begin with reasonable questions about our family's patriotism, but gradually become examinations of our most private thoughts and beliefs, as if thinking itself has become suspicious. The language Ferdinand's administration used to describe these programs was evolving in a particularly disturbing direction. Initial documents refer to political education and civic guidance. But by 1815, the official terminology had shifted to ideological purification and mental hygiene. Young people subjected to these programs were no longer being educated. They were being corrected and cleansed of contamination from foreign revolutionary diseases. Ferdinand's secret police networks, which had initially been described as information gathering services for administrative purposes, were transforming into what modern intelligence analysts would recognize as a comprehensive surveillance state. Citizens were encouraged to report suspicious conversations among their neighbors, family members, and co-workers. Children were taught to monitor their parents for signs of disloyalty and rewarded for providing information about unpatriotic activities in their households. The British ambassador Sir Henry Wellesley sent increasingly alarmed dispatches to London, describing the atmosphere of terror that was developing in Spanish society. In one encrypted report from late 1815, he wrote, "His Catholic Majesty has created an environment where every Spanish citizen lives in fear of their own thoughts being discovered. The King's administrative reforms have produced a level of social paranoia that exceeds anything we observed during the French occupation." But here's where Ferdinand's system revealed its true sophistication. The victims of his purification programs weren't just being punished for their political beliefs, they were being systematically broken psychologically and then displayed as examples to terrorize the rest of the population. Liberal intellectuals who had once advocated for constitutional democracy were paraded through Madrid streets as reformed citizens who publicly confessed their errors and praised Ferdinand's wise guidance in saving them from their revolutionary delusions. The Spanish people were beginning to understand that their liberation from French occupation had actually delivered them into the hands of something far more dangerous, a Spanish king who had learned to weaponize fear more effectively than any foreign invader ever could. Ferdinand wasn't just suppressing political opposition, he was conducting systematic psychological warfare against his own people's capacity for independent thought. And the most terrifying part was how efficiently it was working. By 1816, Spanish society had become so paranoid and atomized that organized resistance seemed impossible. Ferdinand had created a nation of informants where every citizen was both a potential victim and a potential collaborator in the system that was destroying their neighbors. But we haven't even reached the worst part yet. What I've described so far was just Ferdinand's warm-up act, the preliminary stages of a system that would eventually become so brutal that it created the template for modern totalitarian states. The real horror was happening behind closed doors in the questioning facilities where Ferdinand personally designed new methods of breaking human beings that would make medieval torture chambers look like Sunday school. The royal palace of Madrid's basement levels, which had once served as wine cellars and storage rooms, were quietly converted into what Ferdinand's administration euphemistically called correction facilities. These weren't traditional prisons, they were psychological laboratories where Ferdinand himself conducted experiments in human breaking that combined medieval torture techniques with systematic mental warfare designed to destroy not just bodies, but souls. Palace records discovered hidden in wall cavities during 20th century renovations reveal that Ferdinand took personal interest in designing custom torture devices for different categories of political prisoners. Liberal intellectuals were subjected to what he called the constitutionalist's chair, a device that slowly crushed victims' limbs while forcing them to recite monarchist propaganda. The pain was calibrated to increase with each incorrect response, creating a conditioning process that associated democratic ideas with physical agony. Dr. Vicente Alcalá Galiano, a prominent liberal physician who survived 18 months in Ferdinand's facilities, managed to smuggle out detailed notes describing the king's personal involvement in torture sessions. His Majesty arrives each evening after dinner. Galiano wrote, dressed in court finery, as if attending a theatrical performance. He positions himself in a specially constructed viewing chair and provides commentary on the effectiveness of various techniques, suggesting modifications to improve their psychological impact. Ferdinand's innovation wasn't just the cruelty, it was the systematic nature of his approach to breaking human beings. Each prisoner underwent what palace documents describe as comprehensive personality dissolution protocols. These began with medical examinations designed to identify each victim's specific physical and psychological vulnerabilities. Ferdinand's court physicians were required to create detailed profiles noting everything from childhood fears to sexual anxieties that could be exploited during interrogation sessions. The king's personal notebooks, written in his own hand, contain meticulous observations about which torture techniques produced the most complete psychological surrender. He rated different methods on scales of efficiency, entertainment value, and long-term compliance effectiveness. Ferdinand wasn't just a sadist, he was a scientist of human suffering who approached torture with the methodical precision of a research project. Queen Maria Josefa Amalia, Ferdinand's second wife, became an unwilling witness to her husband's nocturnal activities when palace protocols required her presence during certain state ceremonies. Her letters to her sister, intercepted by Spanish intelligence and preserved in Habsburg archives, describe Ferdinand's excitement as he watched prisoners being broken. He becomes animated in ways I have never observed during our marital relations. His face assumes an expression of intense concentration, and he takes careful notes as if studying a fascinating natural phenomenon. The Queen's attempts to intervene on behalf of prisoners led to what palace physicians delicately described as marital correction sessions, where Ferdinand applied his torture expertise to his own wife. Maria Josefa's medical records, maintained by Dr. Francisco Javier de Balmis, document systematic evidence of physical abuse, including broken bones, internal injuries, and what modern doctors would recognize as severe psychological trauma resulting from repeated sexual violence. By 1817, Maria Josefa had made multiple suicide attempts, each one carefully documented by palace staff who were required to monitor her behavior for signs of disloyalty to her royal husband. Her final attempt, which succeeded in 1819, involved consuming mercury stolen from the palace pharmacy, a particularly agonizing death that took 3 days and left her body so damaged that Ferdinand ordered a closed-casket funeral to prevent gossip about the Queen's condition. But Ferdinand's systematic cruelty extended far beyond individual torture sessions. He transformed public executions into theatrical spectacles that served as mass psychological warfare against the Spanish population. Liberal prisoners were not simply killed, they were slowly dismembered in Madrid's main square, while Ferdinand provided running commentary about the educational value of witnessing the consequences of disloyalty. The king's personal collection of souvenirs from these executions became legendary among palace staff, who whispered about rooms filled with preserved body parts displayed like hunting trophies. Ferdinand reportedly kept the severed heads of prominent liberal leaders in glass cases throughout his private chambers, arranged according to the chronology of their captures and labeled with brass plates describing their crimes against the crown. British diplomatic correspondence from this period contains increasingly horrified observations about Ferdinand's public behavior during executions. Ambassador Wellesley wrote, "His Catholic Majesty applauds particularly creative methods of inflicting pain as enthusiastically as he might appreciate a well-performed opera. He has been observed laughing with genuine delight when prisoners are subjected to procedures that cause other observers to physically ill." The psychological impact of Ferdinand's reign of terror on Spanish society was precisely what he intended: the complete atomization of any capacity for collective resistance. Citizens became so terrified of being associated with subversive ideas that they stopped reading, stopped discussing politics, and started reporting their own family members to demonstrate their loyalty to the crown. Ferdinand had discovered something that wouldn't be fully understood until the totalitarian experiments of the 20th century. Systematic terror doesn't just suppress opposition. It fundamentally rewires how human beings think about power resistance and their own capacity for moral action. He wasn't just killing liberals, he was performing surgery on the Spanish national psyche to remove its capacity for democratic thought. Modern psychiatric analysis of Ferdinand's documented behaviors reveals a pathological profile that combines multiple severe personality disorders with what appears to be genuine sexual sadism directed specifically at political enemies. Dr. Luis Simaro's posthumous study of Ferdinand's medical records concluded that the king exhibited classic symptoms of what modern psychiatrists would classify as psychopathic personality disorder, combined with necrophilic tendencies and a systematic delusion that physical torture could literally purify political thought. But here's what makes Ferdinand's story particularly chilling: his methods worked exactly as intended. By 1820, organized liberal resistance in Spain had been so thoroughly destroyed that it took a military revolt led by Rafael del Riego to challenge Ferdinand's authority. And even that rebellion was ultimately crushed with such spectacular brutality that it traumatized Spanish politics for generations. The question we need to ask ourselves is not whether Ferdinand was a monster. The historical evidence for that is overwhelming. The question is how a single individual's psychological pathology was able to transform an entire nation's political culture so completely that Spain spent the next century struggling to recover from the psychological wounds inflicted during Ferdinand's reign. Because the real curse of Ferdinand VII wasn't supernatural, it was the discovery that systematic cruelty could be weaponized to reprogram how entire populations think about power resistance and their own humanity. And once that knowledge exists in the world, it never really disappears. Ferdinand VII's reign of terror didn't end with his death in 1833. It metastasized into a century of Spanish political violence that continues to shape the country today. The psychological warfare techniques he pioneered became the template for every totalitarian movement that followed, and the trauma he inflicted on Spanish society created fault lines that eventually erupted into the Spanish Civil War and Franco's fascist dictatorship. The immediate consequences of Ferdinand's death were catastrophic for Spanish political stability. His systematic destruction of liberal institutions meant that when he died, Spain had no functioning democratic mechanisms for managing political transitions. The succession crisis that followed, known as the First Carlist War, was really a delayed explosion of all the tensions Ferdinand had suppressed through terror rather than resolved through legitimate governance. Ferdinand's brother Carlos, who had been designated heir under traditional succession laws, represented the ultra-conservative faction that wanted to continue Ferdinand's authoritarian methods. The liberals, who had been driven underground for 20 years, rallied around Ferdinand's infant daughter Isabella and her mother Maria Cristina, hoping that a regency government might finally restore constitutional monarchy. The result was 7 years of brutal civil war that killed over 140,000 people and devastated Spanish society. But the most lasting damage from Ferdinand's reign wasn't political, it was psychological. He had spent 20 years systematically training Spanish citizens to expect that political opposition would result in torture and death. This created what historians now call authoritarian learned helplessness, a social condition where populations become so traumatized by state violence that they lose the capacity to imagine democratic alternatives. Spanish liberal movements throughout the 19th century were haunted by what Ferdinand had done to their predecessors. Every attempt at democratic reform was undermined by collective memories of the correction facilities and public executions that had destroyed previous generations of liberal leaders. Spanish politicians learned to expect that political involvement meant risking not just their own lives, but systematic torture of their families. The Spanish-American independence movements were directly accelerated by Ferdinand's brutality. When news of his torture methods reached the American colonies, it convinced even moderate colonial leaders that negotiated independence was impossible. Simon Bolivar's correspondence from this period explicitly references Ferdinand's demonic cruelty as proof that Spanish rule had become incompatible with civilized government. Mexico, Argentina, Colombia, Venezuela, and the other Spanish-American territories that achieved independence during Ferdinand's reign weren't just rejecting Spanish political control, they were fleeing from a monarch whose systematic sadism had convinced them that continued association with Spain meant eventual subjugation to a psychopathic terrorist state. The economic consequences of Ferdinand's reign were equally devastating. International trade with Spain collapsed as European merchants became unwilling to conduct business in a country where commercial disputes might result in torture and execution. The Spanish economy, which had been slowly recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, went into a tailspin that lasted for decades and left Spain as the poorest major country in Western Europe. But Ferdinand's most important historical legacy was methodological. His systematic approach to psychological warfare provided the blueprint that 20th century totalitarian movements would use to control populations through terror. The techniques he developed, mass surveillance, systematic torture, public executions as psychological warfare, and the use of family members as hostages to ensure compliance became standard features of fascist and communist dictatorships. Adolf Hitler's Gestapo studied Spanish police methods developed during Ferdinand's reign. Joseph Stalin's NKVD adopted torture techniques that Ferdinand had pioneered in his palace dungeons. Francisco Franco, who ruled Spain from 1939 to 1975, explicitly modeled his regime on Ferdinand's methods and considered himself the true heir to Ferdinand's authoritarian legacy. The Spanish Civil War of 1936-1939 was in many ways a delayed continuation of the conflicts Ferdinand had initiated but never resolved. The political polarization that made democratic compromise impossible, the expectation that political differences would be settled through violence rather than negotiation, and the deep cultural divisions between traditional and modern Spain all trace back to the psychological wounds Ferdinand had inflicted on Spanish society. When Franco's nationalist forces began executing Republican prisoners during the Civil War, they were using execution methods that Ferdinand had developed over a century earlier. The mass graves that still dot the Spanish countryside contain victims of a political culture that Ferdinand had created, one where systematic murder was considered a legitimate tool of governance. Even today, Spain struggles with what historians call the Ferdinand syndrome, a political culture where partisan differences are perceived as existential threats requiring total victory rather than democratic compromise. The intense polarization that characterizes modern Spanish politics, the difficulty of forming stable coalition governments, and the recurring separatist movements in Catalonia and the Basque Country all connect back to Ferdinand's systematic destruction of Spanish political institutions. Modern Spanish psychiatrists have documented what they term generational trauma transmission, the way that Ferdinand's reign of terror created psychological patterns that were passed down through families for generations. Children whose grandparents had been tortured during Ferdinand's reign showed elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and political cynicism even when they had no conscious knowledge of their family histories. The most chilling aspect of Ferdinand's legacy is how efficiently his methods have been adopted by modern authoritarian movements around the world. The disappearances practiced by Latin American military dictatorships, the systematic torture programs developed by the Khmer Rouge, and the psychological warfare techniques used by ISIS all show clear methodological connections to innovations Ferdinand pioneered in the royal palace of Madrid. Ferdinand VII proved that a single psychopathic individual with sufficient power could fundamentally alter a nation's political DNA, creating patterns of authoritarianism and violence that persist for centuries. He demonstrated that systematic cruelty isn't just about suppressing immediate opposition. It's about rewiring how entire societies think about power resistance and human dignity. The question his reign poses for modern democracies is deeply uncomfortable. How do we prevent future Ferdinands from gaining power? How do we recognize the early warning signs of systematic psychological warfare against civilian populations? And how do we heal societies that have been traumatized by leaders who understand that broken people are easier to control than free people? Ferdinand's story isn't just historical curiosity. It's a warning about what happens when we stop paying attention to the psychological fitness of those who seek power over others. The monster king of Spain discovered that absolute power combined with absolute cruelty could create a level of social control that would make foreign invasion seem like liberation by comparison. And the most terrifying thing about Ferdinand VII is that his methods worked exactly as intended. He didn't just rule Spain, he reprogrammed Spanish political culture in ways that are still visible today. The curse he placed on Spanish democracy wasn't supernatural. It was the systematic application of psychological warfare techniques that turned an entire nation into a laboratory for studying how much suffering human beings could endure before they stopped believing in their own capacity for freedom. What do you think? Was Ferdinand VII a uniquely monstrous individual, or was he simply the product of a political system that allowed absolute power to corrupt absolutely? Let me know in the comments what struck you most about this dark chapter of European history. The past has many more secrets buried in official histories, and not all of them are as deeply buried as the powerful would prefer us to believe.